It has been a whopping 5 months since we last talked about this character, and in those 5 months not too much has changed, well in short. In long, there has been a few characters that have benefited from March in a sense. We'll discuss all of that. And lastly, the reason as to why I'm making this update to March to begin with. I don't think anyone could have seen this coming. Okay, maybe some of you. In the previous video, March was to receive her biggest buff to her sole defensive capabilities with the release of Ruan Mei 1.6. Ruan Mei was to give March the wiggle room she needed as a defensive option, thanks to the delay of the enemy's action value once weakness broken, and the synergy it had with damage over time. Damage over time would allow you to essentially triple proc if your cards were played right, because of the fact that freezing the enemy counted as a different debuff, and also delayed the action of the enemy once they took their turn, much like Ruan Mei's ultimate passive effect. So every damage over time character was to see a neat new interaction following the release of Ruan Mei with March in the team. Despite this interaction being new and flashy, that's essentially valuable in some situations, this way of playing wouldn't be mainstream, and that was apparent with how March wasn't to see a usage uptick following this patch. However, I do see the potential later down the line with a premium defensive option that did what March does for the damage over time team, while being a lot more on the safer end for the player. The release of Black Swan in 2.0 gave March a brand new ally to support in the damage over time team. Considering the damage ceiling of the team was to be effectively raised following this character, March would reap the benefits of being more utility focused than a survivability defensive option, because you're able to kill the enemy before you're killed, which was the Feast or Famine playstyle of March at this point. So despite Black Swan's release being a net positive for March, she wasn't to see an increase in usage following this patch, because again, for the average player, this playstyle was just way too risky and required a lot of investment. I don't think there was ever a time we have talked about Misha not in any single video as far as I'm concerned. Not for a specific reason, of course. The character just needs his own dedicated video. So to keep things short, Misha had a niche with freeze, and was able to freeze enemies while doing additional damage to said enemies. While he is a damage dealer first, utility second, March and him kinda competed for the same niche. Both of them were highly regarded as not meta characters, so neither one particularly stood out. And if we're being completely honest, freeze has never been meta, while working very similar to how Ruan Mei's kit functions. Freeze was considered a debuff, which is a good thing. Now, there is some enemies that do have a resistance towards freeze, and with the growth of those enemies and the in-game contents offered, it made March a lot less viable around this time period. The saving grace would be these mobs not being as frequent in the release of Acheron actually. Acheron needed characters in her party that had a debuff application in their kit. March alongside her ultimate was to give an AoE freeze, and with a little bit of effect hit rate, you were bound to land on at least one enemy. This in turn will give Acheron a stack towards her ultimate. A quick detour. You can actually make the most free-to-play friendly team for Acheron consisting of 3 4-stars, 2 of which are given for free in the beginning of the game, and the last being given out for free quite frequently. Asta, much like March, had debuff application in her kit, but considering how outdated these 4-stars were for the average player, it's very apparent why this playstyle isn't very popular. On the banner of Acheron, we had Gallagher, not a preservation character sure, but he was a defensive option regardless that happened to be a 4-star rarity. This automatically gave March further competition as he had easier accessibility, will be given for free in events, and provided a safer team environment while remaining skill point positive. So while March could work in a hypercarry Acheron team, Gallagher was just leagues better while still providing the debuff that Acheron needed for stacks towards her ultimate. He didn't give any cleanse like March did sure, but if we take all of the other pros versus this one con to the character, it would quickly become apparent how less this mattered in the grand scheme of things. This was especially true with the upcoming character. If we are to go based off anything here, it would be that preservation hasn't received any love since the early days. To be honest, most of them are forced to follow suit as abundance characters in terms of planar sets, if they want to provide any damage amplification to the team. So while this path was to remain stagnant, there would finally be a character release that made the path able to reach new heights. Aventurine was an imaginary character residing in the same path as March. Considering the path gave a damage mitigation to the team in the form of shields, or straight up damage mitigation, Aventurine was to give a full team-wide shield that allowed everyone in the party to practically never take damage over the course of the whole fight. That team-wide shield was refreshable without even spending a skill point. It also then helped that he was to give a critical damage taken debuff onto the enemy which allowed him to shine in Acheron teams much more easily than March did. Despite March having a cleanse in her kit, Aventurine gave effect resistance to the whole team, which was arguably better as it didn't require him to use a skill point in the first place. At this point, March was already never used, and with how difficult the current content was, could you honestly blame anyone? When having a discussion about defensive options, March and Natasha was to never be brought up. I mean, these are two characters that have been completely outclassed ever since the introduction of limited defensive options that was to continuously release, or pretty much as time went on. What this meant long term was that 4 stars was a placeholder until more premium options were to come along, and we've seen this time and time again. However, unlike Natasha, March had the perk of being a part of the main group. We just knew eventually she would receive a Den Hang overhaul, and in some fashion because she was the weakest out of anyone in the group. We just didn't know how the situation was going to be tackled, and we also didn't know when either. With the reveal of the Game Awards featuring Starrail, we received a promotion video that had a completely different version of March. Her thematic appearance was in line with the culture behind Starrail's version of China. March the Hunt was her name. After receiving news about this March, we were to receive additional news that she was a part of the Hunt path while being of a different element altogether, imaginary. Fast forward the present day Starrail, and she was to release in patch 2.4 as a 4-star given to the player for free. This new and improved version of March gave an ally extra speed, kind of like Jade in a sense, and gave herself additional buffs depending on the path of said character. If they were of a damaging path excluding Agility, they were to allow March to deal additional damage to the enemy, which is particularly good alongside an already main carry path. If the character was of the defensive and utility paths, then March was to deal extra toughness bar damage that matched the elemental typing of the allies she would have the buff present on. In some teams, she would seem like a good free-to-play alternative to Ruan Mei thanks to her added toughness break. And in other teams, she would seem like a good secondary damage dealer if the content called for it. Her damage was actually pretty good, as she buffed her own stats via damage amplification and worked extremely well with some of the present relics and planar options. For instance, she works extremely well with the follow-up attack planar set in a team alongside Yun Li or Topaz. In a team alongside Firefly, she works well in the Acheron relic set that deals additional damage against debuffed targets and further critical stats given to the character. What a good time period to be a March fan, especially with the current uptick of follow-up attack teams becoming more and more meta. Even being a break effect enjoyer is nice with this version of March with her added toughness break potential. Compared to her previous 4-star version, this one is a lot more versatile and actually has a stronger niche and use case when compared to the preservation one. I can admit this, even if I prefer the old design more. What was the general sentiment and usage of the character around this point in time? I think the usage is known without being said as she's a free and useful character. But if we're being completely honest here, it may not be anything too crazy as a lot of players may already have established teams, but this is definitely nicer for the new and returning players. As for the community sentiment around the character, I think most people are just happy about March receiving a new form and some love for being the odd one left out for quite some time. Thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of your day.